You know, usually when we talk about a country's borders, uh, we picture physical things like fences, passport control, customs agents checking your bags for, undeclared fruit or something.
Right, yeah.
You're either in the country or you're out. It's tangible. But when you look at how a nation interacts with the rest of the world financially, that physical border is just completely irrelevant.
It really is.
We're looking at this invisible, highly complex perimeter. It's an architecture of money moving through cables and servers, governed by rules that can honestly, literally make or break the national economy.
It is the absolute definition of a macroeconomic force field.
Though-
And unlike a physical border where the rules are relatively static, don't bring in contraband, show your passport, the rules governing this financial border, they have to constantly adapt.
Because the world is always changing.
Exactly. They adapt to global pressures, domestic crises, and just the sheer terrifying speed of modern capital flows.
And for decades in India, those rules weren't just strict. They were literally a matter of life and death, driven by famine and war. So today we are doing a deep dive into Chapter 18 of the Reserve Bank of India's Functions and Working Framework.
That's right, their manual on foreign exchange management.
And since you, the listener, are probably gearing up for a major exam or just aiming for absolute mastery of these financial systems, we're doing something a little different today. We are going to act as expert academic researchers and instructional designers.
Oh, I like that.
Right. We're going to construct a highly detailed mental infographic blueprint of this incredibly dense document. By the end of this deep dive, you will have a complete structural understanding of this chapter. You won't even need to reread the original text.
That is a bold promise, but I think we can deliver.
I know we can. So let's lay the foundation for this blueprint. Can you give us the overarching theme, the core concept here?
Sure. So the blueprint heading for Section 1 is From Control to Facilitation, the Architecture of India's Foreign Exchange Management.
Okay, I'm visualizing that at the top of the infographic. Give me the two-sentence summary.
Okay, here's the core objective. This chapter maps the paradigm shift in India's approach to foreign exchange, transitioning from a draconian era of conservation and restriction under FERA to a liberalized framework of facilitation and market development under FEMA 1999.
Okay, that's sentence one.
Right. Sentence 2 is it details the precise regulatory mechanisms, transaction classifications, and institutional frameworks the Reserve Bank of India uses to manage external trade, capital flows, and the gradual internationalization of the rupee.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit before we build out the rest of the blueprint. We use the word draconian for the old system. Was it really that intense? I mean, was it just standard economic policy for the time? Why was conservation the ultimate goal back then?
To understand the severity of the old system, FERA, you really have to mentally place yourself in the geopolitical and economic reality of the 1960s. When economists call FERA draconian, it isn't hyperbole. No, not at all. Foreign exchange, meaning U.S. dollars, British pounds, foreign currency reserves, wasn't just an abstract financial metric. It was a critically scarce, heavily rationed national resource. Think of it like a country facing a multi-year drought, where water literally has to be guarded by the military.
Wow. Because, India wasn't exactly exporting a massive surplus of manufactured goods or software back then to earn those dollars, right?
Exactly. The industrial base was still in its infancy. Export earnings were incredibly low, but the demand for imports was existential. In the 1960s, India faced acute, devastating food shortages.
Right, the famines.
Yes. The most critical use of foreign exchange at that time was literally to import food grains from abroad to prevent mass starvation.
So the math is brutally simple. Every dollar a citizen or a company spends on importing a luxury good or machinery or paying for a vacation abroad, that is a dollar the government cannot use to buy wheat for the population.
That is the exact historical context of scarcity. If you view foreign exchange as the only means to buy the food your citizens need to survive, you don't just regulate it, you lock it down.
You hoard it.
You criminalize the misuse of it. That is why the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act of 1973 FERA was built entirely around the concept of conservation. The state felt it had to hold on to every single drop of foreign currency it could find.
That paints a much darker, much more necessary picture of that era. It wasn't just bureaucrats wanting to control things for the sake of power. It was an existential necessity.
Exactly.
But obviously, India isn't operating under those famine conditions today. So how did the country dig itself out of that bunker mentality?
I'd like to trace the chronology of this for our blueprints timeline section because it seems like every major shift was forced by an external shock.
It absolutely was.
Okay.
The evolution of India's foreign exchange management is essentially a history of crises forcing systemic upgrades. Let's start the timeline. The whole concept of exchange control in India didn't even start with independence. It started on September 3, 1939, the onset of World War II.
Right. Under the British government, exchange control was first imposed under the Defense of India rules. The goal here was cure wartime economics. The government needed to direct all available foreign exchange strictly toward nationally important objectives.
Which at that time meant the war effort.
Exactly. So the very DNA of the system was born out of a wartime emergency measure.
Okay, so next point on the timeline. We get to 1947, India gains independence, the war is over, but the controls remain. Why not just open up then?
Because the war was over. But the economic devastation was not. The newly independent nation inherited a really fragile economy. The 1947 introduction of the original Foreign Exchange Regulation Act was designed to ration whatever scarce foreign exchange existed.
To manage external payments and build an industrial base?
Against massive odds, yes. Which leads us to the 1960s, the food crises we just discussed, and eventually culminating in the 1973 version of FERA.
Right, so 1973 goes on the timeline.
Yes, FERA 1973 is the pinnacle of the control era. The preamble of the act itself explicitly stated that its purpose was for the conservation of the foreign exchange resources of the country and the proper utilization thereof.
Conservation, it's basically a legal mandate to hold on to every dollar with a white-knuckle grip.
And it had incredibly sharp teeth to enforce that grip. Under FERA 1973, contravention of the act, meaning violating any of these labyrinthine foreign exchange rules, was treated as a criminal offense.
Wait. I want to make sure I understand the gravity of that. Criminal, as in a business owner making a mistake on an import ledger, doesn't just pay a fine, they could actually go to jail.
Punishable by imprisonment.
That's wild.
The presumption baked into the law was that if you were dealing in foreign exchange outside the incredibly strict government-permitted channels, you weren't just making a paperwork error. You were committing a crime against the state's economic survival.
It was a purely transaction-based control framework where absolutely everything was prohibited unless the RBI specifically permitted it. I can't even imagine the chilling effect that must have had on business. If I'm a CEO trying to expand internationally, I might just abandon the idea entirely rather than risk a prison sentence over a misunderstood regulation.
It was a completely paralyzing way to run an economy.
So what breaks the fever? Where are we next on the timeline?
Two major structural shifts begin to happen from the mid-1980s to 1991. First, the Green Revolution takes hold. India dramatically increases its domestic agricultural production.
So the desperate existential need to import food grains subsides.
Exactly. At the same time, you have a surge in diaspora Indians living in the Gulf and the West, sending remittance back home, injecting fresh foreign currency into the economy. The scarcity starts to ease just a bit.
The drought isn't over, but it's finally raining.
But the real catalyst for structural adjustment, the watershed moment in modern Indian economic history, is 1991, the balance of payments crisis.
Right, the famous 1991 BOP crisis. This goes on the timeline. This is when the music essentially stopped. India ran out of foreign exchange to pay for its imports.
It was dire. The country was down to just a few weeks of import cover. They literally had to airlift national gold reserves to pledge to the Bank of England to secure emergency loans.
Oh, wow.
The crisis was so severe that it shattered the old consensus and forced a massive rapid shift. Between July 1991 and March 1993, India transitions from a tightly controlled, pegged exchange rate to a flexible one.
How do you even engineer a transition like that without the entire currency collapsing overnight? You can't just flip a switch from totally controlled to free market.
You can't. It started with a two-step exchange rate adjustment in July of 1991 to devalue the currency to a more realistic level. But the really brilliant transition mechanism came in March 1992 with the introduction of LERMS.
Okay, LERMS, L-E-R-M-S. The Liberalized Exchange Rate Management System. Put that on the blueprint. Break down the mechanics of this for me. What did this actually do?
LERMS introduced a dual exchange rate system. Essentially, the government said to exporters, when you earn foreign exchange, 40% of those earnings must be surrendered to the RBI at the official government-set exchange rate.
Okay, and the RBI used those relatively cheap dollars to ensure the country could still afford essential imports.
Exactly. Things like oil, fertilizers, and life-saving drugs.
So the government still gets its guaranteed cut to keep the lights on, but what about the other 60%?
That remaining 60% could be converted by the exporter at the open market-determined rate.
Oh, that is a very clever release valve. It gives exporters a taste of the free market. They get a much better, more realistic exchange rate for the bulk of their earnings, which incentivizes them to export more.
Yep.
But the government still maintains a safety net for critical national imports.
It was essentially training wheels for a free market. It allowed the market to discover the true value of the rupee while preventing an immediate shock to essential supplies.
And did it work?
It worked so effectively that by March 1993, just 1 year later, the training wheels came off. India moved to a completely unified, market-determined exchange rate system.
That is a staggering pace of change. From jailing businessmen for holding foreign currency to a market-determined exchange rate in roughly 2 decades.
It really was.
Which brings us to the formal legislative shift on the timeline, June 1st, 2000.
This is the definitive death of FERA and the birth of FEMA. The Foreign Exchange Management Act of 1999 comes into effect on June 1st, 2000.
The change in the acronym says it all. We moved from regulation to management.
Exactly. Regulation implies you are trying to suppress an activity. Management implies you are trying to optimize it. And we see that semantic shift happen again a few years later. On January 31st, 2004, the RBI officially changes the name of the department overseeing all of this.
From the Exchange Control Department to the Foreign Exchange Department,
They completely scrubbed the word control from the door.
language dictates policy.
It signaled to the global and domestic markets that the RBI's posture had permanently shifted from a defensive crouch to an open, facilitative stance.
And looking at the most recent developments in the text, it seems that facilitative stance is now pushing into aggressive globalization. We have 2 key milestones from 2022 to finish out the timeline section.
Yes. July 2022 is critical. The RBI introduced the Special Rupee Vostro Account, or SRVA, mechanism. This allows for international trade invoicing, payment, and settlement to happen entirely in Indian rupees.
Let me make sure I grasp the gravity of that. Normally, if an Indian company buys heavy machinery from Germany, they have to buy US dollars or euros and pay the German company in that currency.
Right.
The SRVA mechanism means the Indian company can just pay in rupees, and the German supplier accepts those rupees into a special account.
Correct. It bypasses the US dollar entirely for those specific bilateral trades. It's a massive, tangible step toward the internationalization of the INR.
And right on the heels of that,
In August 2022, the government notified the new overseas investment regime, simplifying the framework for Indians investing abroad. It recognized that Indian businesses are global players who need to deploy capital internationally quickly.
okay, so that's our timeline blueprint. We've seen how 1991 blew up the old system and how the last 20 years have been about building highways for capital. But when you open the borders to free-flowing capital, how does the RBI actually track what is happening?
That is the central operational challenge of FEMA. And it brings us to Section 3 of our blueprint, key terminology and definitions.
Right. Because if money is just digital signals moving across borders, how do regulators distinguish between money building a factory in Pune versus a tourist buying croissants in Paris?
That brings us to the most fundamental dividing line in the entire framework, the difference between a capital account transaction and a current account transaction. Properly classifying a transaction into one of these 2 buckets is the first step in applying any foreign exchange rule.
Let's start with the capital account. For the exam-ready blueprint, what is the precise definition here?
The legal definition is highly specific. A capital account transaction is any transaction that alters the assets or liabilities, including contingent liabilities outside India of a person resident in India. Or, conversely, it alters the assets or liabilities in India of a person resident outside India.
Okay, alters the assets or liabilities. I want to ground this in reality. What does that actually look like for a person or a company?
Think of it through the lens of a balance sheet. Imagine a software entrepreneur living in Bangalore. She is a resident in India. She takes some of her profits and decides to buy a commercial real estate property in London.
Okay.
Before the transaction, her assets outside India were 0. After the transaction, she holds a physical, enduring asset outside the country. Her asset position across the border has been altered. Therefore, purchasing that real estate is a capital account transaction.
That makes sense for money leaving the country. What about money coming in?
Let's look at a venture capital fund based in San Francisco. They are a resident outside India. They decide to wire $10 million to buy equity in a startup based in Hyderabad.
Right, happening all the time.
Before that wire transfer, their assets in India were 0. Now, they hold shares in an Indian company. Their assets in India had been altered. That is also a capital account transaction.
And the definition mentioned liabilities, too.
Yes, if an Indian manufacturing firm takes a $100 million loan from a bank in Tokyo, they have just altered their liabilities outside India. They now owe a foreign entity money. That is a capital account transaction.
And contingent liability.
It includes contingent liabilities. If an Indian parent company issues a corporate guarantee for a loan taken by its subsidiary in Singapore, that guarantee is a contingent liability. It's a capital account transaction.
Got it. If it touches the long-term balance sheet across a border, it's capital. So then what exactly is a current account transaction?
The beauty of the FEMA framework is its simplicity on this front. A current account transaction is defined negatively. It is simply any transaction other than a capital account transaction.
They just define it as everything else.
Essentially, yes. If it doesn't permanently alter the cross-border balance sheet, it falls into the current account. These are mostly revenue in nature. It encompasses the day-to-day flow of an economy.
Like exports and imports.
Exactly. Personal remittances, paying interest on a foreign loan, sending money to support your parents abroad, or traveling overseas.
Let me test the logic on that last one. If I live in Delhi and I go on a month-long vacation to Paris, I'm taking foreign exchange out of the country. I'm spending money on hotels, dinners, train tickets. My bank account balance is definitely going down. Doesn't that alter my assets?
It reduces your cash, certainly.
Hmm.
But you aren't acquiring a lasting asset or incurring a long-term liability in France. You're consuming a service. When you check out of the hotel, you don't own the room.
Ah, I see.
It's a revenue expense, an income statement item, not a balance sheet item. Therefore, it's a current account transaction. The litmus test is always, are you acquiring an asset or a liability that endures past the immediate transaction? If the answer is no, it's current.
That is a brilliant way to separate the two. Balance sheet equals capital. Income statement or day-to-day spending equals current.
Exactly.
Now, in both of those definitions, you repeatedly use the phrases person resident in India and person resident outside India. How does the RBI define who is who? Because if I take that month-long vacation to Paris, do I suddenly become a resident of France in the eyes of Indian regulator?
Absolutely not. Classifying a person's residency correctly is just as critical as classifying the transaction. And under FEMA, person resident in India has a very specific two-pronged legal test.
And this goes in the blueprint.
Yes. It is completely independent of citizenship or what passport you hold. The first prong is purely mathematical. You must have been residing in India for more than 182 days during the preceding financial year.
Okay, so more than half the year. That's a standard tax residency concept in many countries.
Yes, but under FEMA, the days alone aren't enough. That's only part one. The second prong is about intent. You must be residing in India with the intent to stay for an uncertain period, or for taking up employment, or carrying on a business or vocation.
So it's the physical presence of 182 days, plus the demonstrable intent to build an economic life there.
Precisely. Let's look at an edge case. Suppose an American citizen comes to India to take up a multi-year contract at a tech firm in Pune. In the previous financial year, they were in India for 190 days.
They meet the day count.
And because they have a multi-year employment contract, their intent is clear. For the purposes of foreign exchange, that American citizen is a person resident in India and is subject to the exact same outward remittance limits as an Indian citizen.
Wow, okay. And what happens in reverse? Let's say an Indian citizen gets a job in Dubai.
The moment an Indian citizen leaves India to take up permanent employment in Dubai or starts a business there, their intent to stay outside India for an uncertain period is established. They immediately become a person resident outside India.
Even though they still hold an Indian passport.
Citizenship doesn't matter for this classification, and this is a crucial point. The category of person resident outside India, often referred to as non-residents, explicitly includes non-resident Indians, or NRIs, and overseas citizens of India, OCIs.
Okay, so even though they have deep cultural ties, family, or citizenship,
From a foreign exchange regulatory perspective, because their economic base is abroad, they're subject to the non-resident rules.
okay. So we've established what kind of transactions are happening and who is conducting them. But how does the actual exchange of currency happen? I mean, I can't just walk up to a guy on the street and trade millions of rupees for dollars.
No, you definitely cannot. FEMA strictly prohibits dealing in foreign exchange outside of recognized channels. All transactions must be routed through entities specifically authorized by the RBI under Section 10(1) of the Act.
Which are known as.
These entities are collectively known as authorized persons, or APs.
They are the toll booths on our invisible financial border.
Exactly. They act as the gatekeepers, the reporters, and the facilitators all at once. This category includes authorized dealer banks, full-fledged money changers, and specific financial institutions. They actually execute the trades and ensure the paperwork is filed with the central bank.
We will definitely dig into how those dealers are categorized in the next section because I know there's a strict hierarchy there. But I want to move to a term that I found incredibly fascinating when reading this chapter: compounding of contraventions.
Ah, yes.
It sounds like a chemical process, but it's actually one of the most vital legal mechanisms in the entire FEMA framework. What exactly is it?
If you want to understand the true difference in philosophy between the old FERA days and the modern FEMA era, look no further than compounding. Under Section 15 of FEMA, compounding is a legal mechanism where a person or a corporate entity who has committed a contravention, meaning they broke a foreign exchange rule, can voluntarily admit to the mistake and ask the RBI to compound it.
So instead of waiting to get caught, you raise your hand and say, hey, I messed up. What happens next? Do they just forgive you?
They don't forgive it, but they civilize it. When you apply for compounding, you detail the error. The RBI reviews the case and imposes a calculated monetary penalty based on the size and nature of the contravention.
Okay.
Once you pay that penalty, the contravention is officially compounded. This means the matter is entirely resolved. There's no further litigation, no protracted court battles, and crucially, no criminal record. It transforms a potentially devastating legal crisis into a swift administrative civil settlement.
That is a massive paradigm shift for the ease of doing business. Let's play this out. Let's say an Indian startup receives $1 million in venture capital from a U.S. fund. They're supposed to file a specific form with the RBI within 30 days to report this capital account transaction.
Right.
The startup's accountant gets sick, the paperwork falls through the cracks, and they file it 60 days late. What happens under the old FERA system versus today?
Under the old FERA system, that 30-day delay wasn't just an administrative oops, it was a criminal offense. The Directorate of Enforcement could theoretically raid the office, seize documents, and the founders could face prosecution and potential jail time for failing to report foreign exchange movements.
Just for a late filing?
Yes, the fear of that disproportionate punishment paralyzed businesses. It made foreign investors incredibly wary of Indian compliance risks.
And under FEMA today?
Under FEMA, the founders realized they missed the deadline. They voluntarily approached the RBI, submit the compounding application, and explain it was an administrative oversight. The RBI says, okay, you missed the deadline. The penalty is equivalent to a few $1,000s.
So you just pay it and move on?
The startup pays the fine, the issue is closed, and everyone goes back to building the business. It removes the existential dread of minor regulatory errors while still enforcing compliance.
It acknowledges that in a fast-moving, high-volume global economy, mistakes will happen, and treating every mistake as treason is just counterproductive. Let's move to two terms that are the absolute bedrock of global finance: FDI and FPI. Foreign direct investment versus foreign portfolio investment. Both involve foreign money coming into Indian companies, but the regulators treat them very differently. Where is the line drawn for our blueprint?
The line is very sharp and highly quantitative. The dividing line is a 10% ownership threshold on a fully diluted basis.
Fully diluted meaning calculating it as if all convertible bonds and stock options have been turned into shares.
Exactly. So if a foreign entity invests in 10% or more of the paid-up equity capital of a listed Indian company, that is classified as foreign direct investment, or FDI.
Okay, 10% or more is FDI.
Furthermore, if a foreign entity invests any amount in an unlisted Indian company, say a private tech startup, that is automatically considered FDI, regardless of the percentage.
Good distinction.
On the other hand, if a foreign investor buys less than 10% of the equity in a listed Indian company, it is classified as foreign portfolio investment, or FPI.
I understand the math, but I want to push back on the logic. Why does the RBI care so deeply if an American mutual fund owns 9% of an Indian bank versus 11%? What magical economic shift happens at that 10% threshold that requires an entirely different regulatory framework?
It's not magic. It's about boardroom dynamics and macroeconomic stability. 10% is the globally recognized, albeit slightly arbitrary threshold, where an investor's intent shifts.
How so?
Below 10%, you are generally considered a passive investor. You are buying shares on the stock exchange because you think the price will go up. You don't want a seat on the board. You don't want to run the company. You just want a return.
And because you are passive, you can also sell those shares tomorrow if the global economic winds shift.
That's the hot money.
Right.
Yes, FPI is hot money. It can flow into the country rapidly in floating asset prices, and it can flow out just as rapidly, causing a currency crash.
But when you cross that 10% threshold,
The assumption changes. If you are buying 10% or 15% or 50% of a company, you aren't just looking for a quick trade. You are looking to exert significant influence or active control over the management of the enterprise. You are likely bringing in technology, appointing directors, perhaps building physical supply chains. You are a partner, not a trader.
and because you are deeply entrenched, you can't just hit sell on an app and pull your money out overnight.
Exactly. FPI is sticky capital. It is long-term, stable, and builds actual economic capacity. Because FPI is volatile and FDI is stable, the RBI regulates them entirely differently, actively encouraging FDI while putting speed bumps and limits on FPI to prevent systemic shocks.
Which perfectly segues into the final major definition in this section. ECBs, external commercial borrowings. If equity is one way to raise money, debt is the other.
External commercial borrowings are exactly what they sound like. They are commercial loans raised by eligible resident entities, like an Indian manufacturing giant or a massive infrastructure project, from recognized non-resident entities, like a syndicate of foreign banks or a foreign parent company.
Why not just borrow from an Indian bank? Why go through the hassle of an ECB?
Scale and cost. If you are building a multi-billion-dollar solar farm, the domestic banking system might not have the capacity to lend you that much at a competitive interest rate. Global debt markets are much deeper and often offer lower interest rates. ECBs are a vital tool for Indian companies to access massive pools of global capital.
But I imagine the RBI doesn't just let companies borrow unlimited amounts of US dollars. There has to be a catch.
The catch is systemic risk. Let's play out a disaster scenario. Imagine every major Indian corporation decides to take out massive dollar-denominated ECBs because the interest rates are cheap. They take the dollars, convert them to rupees, and build their domestic businesses. Their revenue is generated in rupees.
Okay, so they are earning rupees, but their debt obligation is in dollars.
Now imagine a global crisis hits, and the value of the rupee crashes by 20% against the dollar.
Oh boy.
Suddenly, every single one of those Indian corporations needs 20% more rupees just to make their monthly interest payments. Their debt burden explodes overnight without them having done anything wrong operationally. If enough companies default, the domestic banks that hold their other accounts fail, and you have a full-blown sovereign financial crisis.
So an individual company's currency risk aggregates into a national macroeconomic risk.
Precisely. That is why ECBs are governed by incredibly strict parameters. The RBI dictates exactly which sectors are eligible to borrow, the maximum amount they can borrow per year, the minimum maturity period of the loan to prevent sudden repayment shocks, and even caps the all-in cost, which is the maximum interest rate they're allowed to agree to.
The RBI wants companies to have access to global debt, but they refuse to let corporate greed bankrupt the national economy.
That is exactly it.
That is a fascinating balancing act. So we've laid out the vocabulary. We know the difference between capital and current transactions. We know who residents and non-residents are. We understand the civil nature of compounding. And we see the profound differences between FDI, FPI, and ECBs. Now, Section 4 of our blueprint, important figures and names. Let's look at the institutional framework. Who are the actual players on the board managing all this traffic? Let's start at the very top.
The apex authority, operating under the broader umbrella of the Reserve Bank of India, is the Foreign Exchange Department, or the FA. They are the architects. They are responsible for administering FEMA, monitoring capital flows, and formulating the macro foreign exchange policy.
They write the rule book. But earlier you mentioned that when things go wrong, like suspected money laundering or severe violations that go beyond a simple compounding settlement, someone else steps in.
Yes. When it moves from policy management to law enforcement, the Directorate of Enforcement takes over. Right. Often referred to simply as the ED. They are the adjudicating authority and the investigative arm for serious contraventions under FEMA. If the Fed are the traffic planners, the ED are the highway patrol.
Okay, so we have the rule makers and the rule enforcers. But what about the entities that actually handle the money for the public? The authorized persons we mentioned earlier. The chapter breaks them down into very specific categories. Why is there a hierarchy here?
The RBI licenses different entities based on their institutional capabilities, their capital buffers, and the risk profile of the transactions they are allowed to handle. It's a system designed to contain systemic risk. At the very top of the pyramid, you have authorized dealer category I, or AD Cat I.
Who falls into this elite tier?
These are the major commercial banks. Your State Bank of India, HDFC, ICICI, foreign banks operating in India, as well as select state and urban cooperative banks. They are the heavyweights of the financial system. They are permitted to handle absolutely all current and capital account transactions.
So if a multinational corporation wants to execute a billion-dollar cross-border acquisition or set up an incredibly complex ECB, they have to use an AD category IBank.
Yes, because handling a transaction of that magnitude requires a highly sophisticated Treasury Department, deep understanding of international compliance, and massive capital reserves to absorb any potential shocks.
Which brings me to my challenge. If the AD category IBanks can do everything, and they are the safest, why do we even need the other tiers? Why not just force everyone to use the big commercial banks and ensure maximum security?
Because that would create a massive bottleneck and stifle the everyday economy. Not every transaction is a billion-dollar merger. That's where we have authorized dealer category too.
And who are they?
These are upgraded full-fledged money changers, certain cooperative banks, and regional rural banks. They don't have the sophisticated treasury operations of a massive commercial bank, so they are not allowed to handle complex corporate capital account transactions or trade financing.
But they can handle what?
They were perfectly capable of handling specified, non-trade, current account transactions.
Give me an example of what they do.
Imagine a family in a smaller city needing to remit money for their daughter's university tuition in the UK, or sending funds for a relative's medical treatment overseas, or a student paying fees for an international certification exam. These are routine, low systemic risk transactions.
Okay, I see.
AD Category 2 entities provide vast geographical reach and convenience for the general public, handling everyday personal remittances without clogging up the corporate banking infrastructure.
Ah, so it's about network scale and matching the capability to the risk. What about Category 3?
Authorized Dealer Category 3 consists of select financial and other institutions that are permitted to carry out specific foreign exchange transactions strictly incidental to their primary business. For example, a major financial institution that deals in cross-border leasing might be granted Category 3 status just to handle the Forex requirements of their leasing contracts.
But they can't start remitting university tuitions for the public.
Exactly. And finally, at the base of the pyramid, we have the FFMCs.
Full-fledged money changers.
Right. These are select registered companies permitted only to purchase foreign exchange and sell it for private or business visits abroad. Think of the currency exchange booths you see at the airport or in heavy tourist districts. They handle physical cash, traveler's checks, and Forex travel cards. Nothing more.
So if an FFMC tried to facilitate an external commercial borrowing?
It would be a massive violation of their license. The hierarchy ensures that high-risk capital flows are managed by institutions robust enough to survive them.
The architecture is really elegant when you break it down. It's a filtration system.
It really is.
Okay, let's pivot to Section 5 of our blueprint, vital statistics and empirical data. We've thrown a lot of concepts around, but in finance, the numbers govern the reality. What are the hard empirical data points embedded in this framework that define how capital moves?
Let's isolate the most critical figures. The first is a number we've already dissected, greater than 182 days.
The residency threshold. You must be in India for more than half the preceding financial year, plus have the intent to stay, to be considered a resident for Forex purposes.
Exactly. The second vital statistic is the 10% threshold.
The dividing line between foreign portfolio investment and foreign direct investment.
Correct. An investment of 10% or more of the paid-up equity capital of a listed Indian entity is FDI. Less than 10% is FPI. Again, 10% represents the mathematical shift from passive trading to active boardroom influence.
Right.
But that brings us to the third critical statistic, which is deeply tied to FPIs, the 24% aggregate limit.
What does that apply to?
This is a macroeconomic defense mechanism. By default, the total aggregate holdings of all foreign portfolio investors put together cannot exceed 24% of an Indian company's paid-up capital.
Wait, let me work through this. Let's say there's a highly successful mid-cap Indian pharma company. 10 different foreign mutual funds, entirely independent of each other, each decide to buy 3% of the company's stock on the open market. Individually, they're well below the 10% FDI threshold. They're just passive FPIs. But collectively, they now own 30% of the company. You're saying the RBI regulations step in and prevent that?
Yes. The system will flag it and stop foreign purchases before they cross that aggregate 24% mark.
Why? If they're independent passive funds, why does the aggregate matter?
Because of the vulnerability to stealth takeovers and the danger of concentrated hot money. Even if the funds are supposedly independent, if 30% or 40% of a critical domestic company is held by volatile foreign portfolio investors, a sudden global panic could cause all of them to sell simultaneously.
Which would be catastrophic.
It would crash the company's stock price, wipe out domestic retail investors, and potentially destabilize the sector. Furthermore, limiting aggregate FPI to 24% ensures that significant control remains either with domestic promoters or with committed long-term FDI investors.
Can a company ever change that limit?
Yes. Now, a company can specifically pass a board resolution and a special resolution in their General Assembly to raise that aggregate limit higher, up to the maximum sectoral cap allowed by the government. But the 24% serves as a hard default barrier that forces a company to actively justify bringing in more hot money.
It's a circuit breaker against foreign financial dominance. That is fascinating. Okay, what is the final vital statistic we need to isolate for the blueprint?
USD 250,000.
250,000 US dollars. What does this figure represent?
That is the maximum limit per financial year under the Liberalized Remittance Scheme, or LRS, for resident individuals.
Okay, let's spend some time on the LRS, because for the average high net worth individual or upper middle class family in India, this is the most famous acronym in FEMA. How does this work in practice?
The LRS is the ultimate symbol of the shift from FERA to FEMA. Under this scheme, any resident individual, including minors, can freely remit up to USD 250,000 out of India every single financial year without needing to ask the RBI for prior permission.
And what can they use it for?
Almost anything legitimate. You can use it for current account transactions like paying for an extensive world tour, funding a child's education abroad, paying for international medical procedures, or supporting relatives living overseas.
Wow.
But, crucially, you can also use it for capital account transactions. You can use that $250,000 to buy shares in Apple or Tesla on the U.S. stock market. You can use it to buy a piece of property in Dubai or London. You can use it to set up a wholly owned subsidiary abroad. It is a fast-track, pre-approved allowance to integrate your personal finances globally.
That is a staggering contrast. In the 1970s, getting $50 approved for a business trip required groveling before a bureaucrat. Today, a family of four could theoretically pool their LRS limits and legally move $1 million out of the country every year to buy overseas assets.
Exactly.
But what happens if a legitimate expense exceeds that limit? Let's say a family is sending their kid to an Ivy League university. Between tuition, housing, and living expenses, maybe it costs $100,000 a year. That's fine, it's under the cap. But what if they also want to buy a $300,000 condo near the campus for the kid to live in? That puts them at $400,000 for the year. They hit the cap. Are they just banned from doing it?
They aren't banned, but they lose the privilege of the fast track. The moment an individual wants to remit an amount exceeding the $250,000 LRS limit, they transition from a pre-approved status to requiring prior approval from the Reserve Bank of India.
Ah, okay.
They have to submit the documentation, explain the rationale, and the RBI will evaluate the macroeconomic conditions before greenlighting the extra remittance. The LRS limit isn't a hard ceiling on your financial ambitions, it's just the threshold where regulatory scrutiny kicks in.
Okay, we had the concepts, the institutions, and the hard numbers. Now, Section 6. Cause and effect relationships. I want to tie all of these threads together. Let's explicitly map them out for the blueprint.
Okay, let's map them. The first major causal chain goes back to our timeline. Because the Green Revolution successfully solved the chronic domestic food grain crises, and because diaspora Indians began sending massive waves of remittances back home.
The existential urgency of foreign exchange scarcity diminished.
Exactly. The consequence of this was profound. This newly found macroeconomic breathing room allowed policymakers to shift their mindset away from sheer survival. It directly led to the initial liberalizations in the 1980s. The cause was agricultural and demographic success. The effect was the genesis of financial liberalization.
It's an incredible thought that the yield of a wheat field directly impacted how many dollars an IT firm could hold 20 years later. Everything is connected.
It really is. Here is the second causal chain, focusing on the psychology of regulation. Because FERA treated almost all unauthorized foreign exchange transactions as criminal offenses punishable by imprisonment.
It created a paralyzing climate of fear that severely stifled the ease of doing business and foreign investment.
Precisely, the consequence. When the 1991 crisis forced an opening of the economy, it became obvious that foreign capital would not enter a country where a clerical error could result in a jail sentence. This realization led directly to FEMA, replacing FERA with a civil offense framework and the introduction of the compounding mechanism.
The cause was regulatory overreach causing economic friction. The effect was the creation of a modernized civil penalty approach. You cannot invite the world to do business with you while holding a gun to their accountant's head. It's that simple. What's the third chain?
The third chain centers on international obligations, because India, as a growing global player, formally accepted Article 8 of the International Monetary Fund's Articles of Agreement.
The country committed to imposing minimal restrictions on the making of payments and transfers for current international transactions.
Yes, the consequence of this treaty obligation led to full convertibility on the current account. It means that if an Indian business is doing legitimate trade, or an individual is engaged in standard personal travel, the government cannot unreasonably hoard the foreign exchange required to facilitate that. The international treaty is the cause. Current account convertibility is the effect.
That makes sense. You can't be a member of the Global Trading Club if you refuse to let your currency freely pay for the goods you import. But what about the final chain? How do they handle the really big money, the capital account?
This is perhaps the most complex and critical causal chain in the entire framework, because short-term debt capital flows, the FTIs and the ECBs, are highly volatile, sensitive to global interest rates, and can trigger rapid financial instability by suddenly fleeing the country.
The RBI enforces a strict managed hierarchy in capital account liberalization.
The consequence is that the RBI's policies actively and aggressively favor long-term inflows over short-term inflows, and they strongly prefer equity, like FDI, over debt, like ECBs.
Let me try to synthesize this. If I'm looking at everything we've discussed today, it seems like the RBI is essentially playing a massive high-stakes game of macroeconomic fluid dynamics. They are the engineers sitting at the control panel of a giant national dam.
I like this analogy.
When it comes to long-term equity foreign direct investment, they open the intake valves as wide as possible. They want that water rushing in because it stays in the reservoir, it turns the turbines, it builds factories, it creates jobs, it's stable.
Yeah.
But when it comes to short-term debt and hot money portfolio investments, they put heavy pressure restrictors, filters, and flow meters on the valves because they know that water can slosh back out just as fast as it came in. And if too much water rushes out at once, the dam cracks, the currency collapses, and you are back in 1991 begging the Bank of England for a loan.
That is an absolutely perfect analogy. The entire architecture of FEMA, the AD categories, the 10% thresholds, the ECB limits, is entirely about managing the pressure of capital flows to ensure macroeconomic stability while still allowing the economy to grow.
Which perfectly sets us up for the final segment of our blueprint today. Section 7, Comparative Matrix. I want to take all these rules and organize them into 3 matrices.
Contrasting opposing models is the best way to ensure you never confuse them for the exam.
Exactly. Let's look at the first comparison. Matrix 1, the rule books. Let's summarize FERA 1973 versus FEMA 1999 across 3 metrics.
The contrast couldn't be starker. Metric 1, the core objective. Under FERA, the objective was conservation and restriction. The state must hoard the wealth. Under FEMA, the objective is facilitation and external trade development. The state must grease the wheels of commerce.
Right.
Metric 2, the regulatory approach. FERA was transaction-based and operated on a negative list approach, meaning absolutely everything was prohibited unless it was explicitly permitted by the RBI. FEMA flipped this on its head. It operates on the principle that the current account is fully convertible with only specific exceptions, and the capital account is regulated but broadly permissible.
And metric 3.
The penalty structure. As we discussed, FERA treated violations as criminal offenses with a threat of imprisonment. FEMA treats violations as civil offenses, utilizing the compounding mechanism for monetary settlements.
It is literally night and day. A shift from a presumption of guilt to a presumption of commerce. Let's move to the second comparison. Matrix 2, current account rules. You just said that under FEMA, the current account is fully convertible with specific exceptions. I want to know exactly what those exceptions are.
Those exceptions are meticulously categorized into 3 distinct schedules under the Foreign Exchange Management Rules of 2000. Schedule 4 is the completely prohibited list. No resident, regardless of how much money they have, can draw foreign exchange for these specific purposes.
Give me some examples. What is completely banned?
A prime example is remitting lottery winnings abroad or purchasing lottery tickets, banned or prescribed magazines, or paying for football pools and sweepstakes.
Let me stop you there, because that sounds almost paternalistic. Why does the RBI care if a rich guy in Mumbai wants to blow $10,000 on an international lottery?
Because it's not paternalism. It's macroeconomic risk management. Remember, foreign exchange reserves are still a national asset backing the currency. If millions of citizens start using the country's precious dollar reserves to gamble on international lotteries or offshore sports betting, you are hemorrhaging national wealth with absolutely zero economic return or asset creation. It is a pure drain on the balance of payments. That's why Schedule I outlaws it completely.
Oh, wow. I never thought of it that way.
Also under Schedule 1, and this is a fascinating geopolitical trivia point, drawal of foreign exchange is completely prohibited for travel to or transactions with Nepal and Bhutan,
Why? They are neighboring countries with massive trade ties to India.
because the Indian rupee already circulates freely and is widely accepted in Nepal and Bhutan. There is no need to drain India's US dollar or euro reserves to facilitate trade with economies deeply integrated with the rupee.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so Schedule 1 is a hard NO. What is Schedule 2?
Schedule 2 contains transactions that require central government approval. These are specific activities where a relevant government ministry needs to review the intent and sign off before the RBI allows the currency to leave.
What kind of transactions require a government minister's approval?
Usually things tied to state policy or massive public expenditures. For example, remittances for cultural tours abroad require approval from the Ministry of Human Resource Development. Remittance of freight charges for a vessel chartered by a public sector undertaking, a government-owned company, requires approval from the Ministry of Surface Transport. They want to ensure state resources and cultural representations are aligned with government policy.
Okay, Schedule 6 is prohibited. Schedule 2 requires the relevant government ministry, which leaves Schedule 3.
Schedule 3 contains transactions that require prior approval, specifically from the Reserve Bank of India. This is where the LRS limit we discussed earlier comes into play. Drawal of foreign exchange for things like private visits, gifts, donations, or studies abroad fall under Schedule 3. Now, as a resident individual, you do not need approval as long as you stay under the USD $250,000 limit.
Ah, okay.
But the moment an individual exceeds that $250 K cap, or the moment a corporation exceeds their specific thresholds for things like consultancy fees or overseas donations, they hit the ceiling of Schedule 3. At that point, they must submit an application and seek prior approval directly from the RBI.
Got it. Schedule 1, prohibited. Schedule 2, central government approval. Schedule 3, RBI approval. That is a very clean, logical way to structure the exceptions. Let's draw our third and final comparative matrix. Matrix 3, non-resident accounts.
This is crucial for the global diaspora.
Right. If I am an NRI, a non-resident Indian living and working in California, I obviously still have financial ties to India. I might have family there. I might have investments there. What are the different bank accounts I can open, and how do they differ in terms of regulation?
If you are an NRI, there are 3 primary accounts you need to understand, and they all serve very different purposes. First is the NRE account, non-resident external rupee account.
What are the defining features of the NRE?
First, as the name suggests, it is denominated in Indian rupees. You send dollars from California, the bank converts them, and your balance reads in rupees. The single most important defining feature, however, is that an NRE account is freely repatriable.
Meaning I can take the money back out of India whenever I want.
Exactly. Both the principal amount you deposited and any interest you earn on it can be moved back to the U.S. without asking anyone's permission. There are no limits. You use an NRE account to park your foreign earnings in India, perhaps to earn a higher interest rate or invest in the Indian stock market, knowing you can pull the ripcord and take the money home at any time.
Okay, NRE is rupee denominated and freely repatriable. What is the second option?
The second is the FCNRB account, foreign currency non-resident account banks. The major difference here is right in the name. It is denominated in foreign currency like US dollars, British pounds, or euros.
So the bank doesn't convert it to rupees.
Correct. If you deposit 100,000 US dollars, your statement reads 100,000 US dollars.
Right.
Like the NRE, the FCNRB, is also freely repatriable. However, it can only be opened as a term deposit, like a fixed deposit or a CD not as a liquid savings account.
Why would an NRI choose the FCNRB over the NRE?
To completely eliminate exchange rate risk.
Right.
If you deposit dollars into an NRE account, they become rupees. If the rupee depreciates against the dollar over the next year, when you try to repatriate your money, you will get fewer dollars back.
Makes sense.
With an FCNRB account, you deposit $100,000, the Indian bank pays you a fixed interest rate, and when the term is up, you get back your $100,000 plus interest, regardless of what the rupee to dollar exchange rate did in the meantime. It's a safe harbor for foreign currency in the Indian banking system.
That is incredibly useful for conservative capital preservation. Now, what is the third account?
The third one is where the regulations get incredibly nuanced, and it's often a point of confusion. It is the NRO account, non-resident ordinary rupee account. Like the NRE, the NRO account is denominated in Indian rupees. But unlike the NRE, the funds in an NRO account are generally considered non-repatriable, subject to specific conditions and a strict cap of USD 1 million per financial year.
Let me push back hard on this. If I'm an NRI in California, why on earth would I ever open an NRO account? If the whole point of being an NRI is global mobility, why would I voluntarily put my money in an account where it gets trapped, or at least heavily restricted, inside India? Why not just use my freely repatriable NRE account for absolutely everything?
Because the RBI won't let you, and it all comes down to the source of the funds. The law mandates that you absolutely cannot deposit local Indian-sourced income into an NRE account. Let's walk through a very common hypothetical scenario.
Okay, let's hear it.
Suppose you live in California, but your parents pass away and you inherit your childhood home in Mumbai. You decide not to sell it. Instead, you rent it out. Every month, your Indian tenant pays you rent in Indian rupees.
Right.
Those rupees were generated inside the Indian domestic economy. You cannot take that locally generated rent and deposit it into your NRE account, because if you did, it would magically transform into freely repatriable foreign exchange.
You would be converting domestic economy money into international capital without regulatory oversight.
Exactly. You legally must deposit that rental income into an NRO account. The NRO account is a practical, legal necessity for managing domestic income and domestic expenses, like paying Indian income taxes, paying the property maintenance fees, or paying local utility bills while you live abroad.
So it's basically a quarantine zone.
Yes. It ensures that local income stays in the local financial ecosystem. Now, the RBI isn't completely unreasonable. They know you eventually want some of that rent money. So they allow you to repatriate funds from the NRO account, but only up to USD 1 million per financial year, and only after you produce certificates from a chartered accountant proving that all applicable Indian taxes on that income have been fully paid.
That is the light bulb moment right there. NRE is for money you brought into India from the outside world. It can go back easily. NRO is for money you earned inside India while living outside. It is heavily restricted to protect the domestic capital base. And FCNRB is for keeping your foreign money in foreign currency safely parked in an Indian bank.
You've got it. If you can conceptualize those three accounts, you fundamentally understand how a central bank manages the finances of a global diaspora.
It's all about tracking the origin of the capital and controlling the velocity of its exit.
Absolutely.
Wow, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We built out the entire blueprint. We started with the trauma of the 1960s famines that birthed the draconian conservation laws of FERA. We traced the history through the 1991 crisis, the genius of the LERM's dual exchange rate, and the dawn of the facilitative FEMA era.
We mapped the mechanics of the system, capital versus current counts, the crucial 182-day residency test, and how the compounding mechanism removed the terror of criminal prosecution from boardrooms.
We isolated the data. The 10% FDI threshold that separates partners from passive traders, the 24% aggregate limit protecting against stealth takeovers, and the $250,000 LRS fast track for families.
And we saw how the RBI acts as the engineers of a macroeconomic dam, eagerly opening the valves for stable long-term FDI while carefully filtering the volatile hot money of short-term debt and FPIs.
When you look at it structurally, you realize that foreign exchange management isn't just about banking compliance. It is the living, breathing defense system of a sovereign economy. The rules exist not to harass businesses, but to prevent the historical trauma of scarcity from ever repeating itself while still giving the country the capital it needs to grow.
Perfectly summarized.
Before we sign off, I know you always like to leave us with something to chew on, something that builds on what we've discussed but looks over the horizon.
I do. And the text gives us the perfect seed for this at the very end when it discusses the recent 2022 push for the special Rupee Vostro accounts, the SRVAs, and the broader internationalization of INR.
Yeah, we briefly mentioned that on the timeline.
This is a paradigm-shifting idea. Think about everything we've discussed today. For the last 80 years, from the wartime defense rules in 1939 through FERA and all the way through FEMA, The entire regulatory framework has been based on one unshakable underlying assumption. India needs foreign currency, and therefore India must meticulously manage how foreign currency enters and exits its borders.
Right. The US dollar has always been the sun, and the rupee has always been in orbit.
Exactly. But consider this forward-looking thought experiment. What happens if the SRV push is wildly successful? What happens if the Indian rupee truly becomes a globally accepted reserve currency in a multipolar monetary system? What if, 20 years from now, countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia start holding hundreds of billions of Indian rupees in their own central banks to settle global trade?
That would be a completely different world.
If that happens, it fundamentally flips the entire concept of FEMA on its head. Instead of the RBI meticulously managing foreign exchange inside India, the RBI would be tasked with managing the impact of Indian exchange held abroad.
Wow.
Are we currently analyzing the final days of traditional foreign exchange management as a defensive posture? Are we preparing for a future where the rupee itself becomes the powerful foreign exchange that other developing nations have to hoard, manage, and regulate?
That is wild. From airlifting national gold reserves to beg for dollars to import wheat, to a future where other sovereign nations are hoarding rupees in their central bank vaults. That is a staggering macroeconomic plot twist.
It changes the definition of what a financial border even is.
It really does. So the next time you cross a physical border and the customs agent asks if you have any undeclared agricultural products, just remember that physical border is the easy part. It's the invisible financial border, the one constantly shifting between control, facilitation, and the aggressive forces of global integration that truly defines the wealth and stability of the world we live in.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Chapter 18. Mastering these complex architectures isn't just about knowing the rules. It's about understanding the history and the macroeconomic forces that write them. Keep questioning how the money flows, and we'll see you on the next one.